Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's all try to get our seats. We've got a full house. We've got a full program to share with you today. I'm George McCarthy. A lot of you know me as Mac. I'm going to be your MC, and we're going to introduce you to the 21st century today. We have a town hall that's both local and wired. We're broadcasting live over the web, and we also have a Twitter feed coming to you live, and we're going to be hearing from our Twitter feed during the day from Tosin, and we're also going to be engaging you actively at a table over here with Milt. Milt is going to raise his hand, and so you know the drill with the cards for asking questions, but today and in this session we're going to have volunteers combing the audience, bringing your cards up to Milt, and if he deems your question good enough, he's going to ask the volunteer to go back and get you and come to the table, and we're going to put you on for your 15 seconds of fame on the internet as well. And as I learned when I was going through high school, this thing is part of your permanent record, because this isn't just today being live broadcast. Unfortunately, it's going to live on the web in infamy for a long time. All right, so the town hall. We've heard a lot today. We've heard a lot about what's going on in the housing market. We've heard a lot about other things. Oh, I forgot one thing. Join us on Twitter at #ReclaimHomeownership. I know a lot of you are multitaskers, so you can be tweeting to our Twitter desk and Tosin, and we can also ask your questions in that way as well during the day. So we've heard a lot today about homeownership, and we've heard a lot really about the challenges and not so much about the solutions. And so hopefully we're going to be focusing a little bit more on solutions today, and we're going to be thinking a little bit more about the role that we all play in some of those solutions. So one of the things that we really have to grapple with, and one of the things we're going to grapple with in this panel, is that we don't do a great job of telling our stories. And we're going to want to think a lot about how we take over the narrative in the homeownership space, because frankly, right now, the narrative isn't working for us too well, and even the narrative that we've heard kind of repeated today, and some of our allies sometimes say not so helpful things about homeownership and don't necessarily get us where we want to be. So one of the things we're going to think a lot about is how we tell our story, and then we're also going to think about how we configure ourselves around the challenges that we hope to grapple with, the role we're going to play in helping to reclaim sustainable homeownership for low-income people in this country, something that we know how to do and something that we want to keep doing into the future. So what's going on in the homeownership front? Well, we already know it's a bleak picture. The homeownership rates now are at 66% and falling, which is about the same rate they were in 1998. And since the peak of homeownership that we hit in 1994, we've lost over 4 million homeowner families from the roles of homeownership. Now, what does that really mean? Well, 4 million families, about 3.3 people per family. Basically, we've moved the equivalent of the city of New York, the city of LA, and the city of San Antonio from ownership into rental in a mere 8 years since 2004. That's a lot of people. We want to move them back. And how are we going to do that? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have to reconcile a lot of kind of conflicting messages we've heard all around. We've heard from the media telling us we've tried to push homeownership too far, that low-income homeowners are responsible for bringing the world economic system to its knees. We didn't know that low-income homeowners were that powerful, but I guess they were. But we've also seen, and we saw it from Eric, otherwise known as Debbie Downer, Eric Belsky, we've seen that 90% of current homeowners think it's a good idea to own. 75% of renters want to become homeowners. Survey after survey by the National Association of Realtors, by the home builders, by Fannie Mae tell us that 80% of families headed by people between the ages of 25 and 45 want to be homeowners. And we also saw from Debbie Downer, aka Eric Belsky, is he still here? He won't mind, that nobody can get financing. And one of the questions we have is, how can we facilitate that with what we know happened over the last 20 years? Successful measures to move low-income people into homeownership that we've all participated in. So how many of you here have been working over the last few years to help people to become homeowners. I want you to, don't just raise your hands, clap, because we're on the, yes, there you go. I would say more than half of the room is actively engaged in helping people to become homeowners. And we're working against headwinds. And I'm going to start with a video that's going to tell you a little bit about some of the narrative we're hearing about homeownership in the United States today. And then I'm going to introduce you to a communication specialist that we've been working with over a little bit of time. So let's go to the video.
We saw what happened over the past decade when we strayed from those values, especially when it comes to the massive housing bubble that burst and hurt so many people. Millions of families who did the right and the responsible thing. Folks who shopped for a home that they could afford, secured a mortgage, made their payments each month. They were hurt badly by the irresponsible actions of other people who weren't playing by the same rules, weren't taking the same care, weren't acting as responsibly. By lenders who sold loans to people who they knew couldn't afford the mortgages, and buyers who bought homes they knew they couldn't afford, and banks that packaged those mortgages up and traded them to reap phantom profits, knowing that they were building a house of cards. It was wrong. It was wrong. It triggered the worst economic crisis of our lifetimes. And it has been the single biggest drag on our recovery from a terrible recession. We need to do everything in our power to repair the damage and make responsible families whole again. Everything we can.
Almost a decade has passed since President George W. Bush, speaking to a predominantly African-American audience at a church in Atlanta, vowed to increase the rates of minority homeownership.
Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream.
Mr. Bush's initiative followed similar efforts under President Clinton, but it was, by most accounts, the expansion of mortgage lending to low-income borrowers who present a higher risk of foreclosure that burst the housing bubble of the last decade and triggered the credit crisis.
As someone who lived in apartments, most of his life, I have never understood why there's some sort of right to live in a house.
And so the solutions for the housing market turn on one's view of the effectiveness of government intervention. Clear to all is that this slumping sector is hampering the recovery of the economy as a whole. In Washington, James Rosen, Fox News.
There you go. Those are the headwinds we're facing. So now let me introduce you to Kedayun Darvish Kajuri, who works with us from Spitfire Strategies, a communications firm in D.C. And so we've been talking a lot, Kedayun, about taking over the narrative, reclaiming home ownership. How are we doing?
Well, not to be Debbie Downer, to use your term. I think that, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think Eric this morning was saying homeownership got a black eye. And I just want to say that if homeownership got a black eye, then the media is actually punching in the other eye, trying to give it two black eyes. If you could see from those clips that we showed that there has been, a bit of a narrative that's being promoted right now in the media around homeownership. And at Spitfire, we've been working with Mac and others to really try and take a look at where the media is around homeownership. And one of the things that we did is took a look at media coverage over the past 2 years to really kind of analyze how mainstream media has been covering the topic of the foreclosure crisis, homeownership, and sort of what the solutions would be around that. And just to give you all a sense of what we were finding, we took a look at about 2,000 media articles over the last 2 years and did an analysis of kind of what the dominant messages were, who was being quoted, and what we saw as being promoted in those articles. Not a surprise to those of us who still actually read the media, read the newspaper, but we really found an overwhelmingly negative narrative around a focus on sort of the problems. I think there's sort of twofold issues with the coverage right now. One is, and I'm thinking about a cover that I saw on the Atlantic magazine last year, which basically said, should home ownership still be part of the American dream? And that was the cover. And you know, there's a lot of coverage that's been happening over the last 2 years that's really kind of detailing all of the negative aspects of homeownership. So even if it's not going into who's to blame for the crisis or what the crisis is, they're really talking about homeownership is contributing to a lack of mobility, that it's sort of locking people into their homes, that it's sort of a complicated thing that's really not something that modern Americans find as useful in the way that they want to live their lives. So a lot of coverage that's basically, you know, sort of the negative aspects of being a homeowner was one really dominant theme that we found. Another dominant theme that we really saw in these articles and in the media coverage in broadcast media was this blame of low-income borrowers, right? That the foreclosure crisis was really caused by low-income borrowers, and that the solution is really about the government moving away from its commitment to homeownership. And so you see a lot of quotes from government officials, even folks that have been champions in the past, where they say, you know, look, you know, as you said, there's been a lot of pain that's been caused by trying to expand homeownership. And where we are now is, you know, we need to help those, as Obama said, responsible buyers, those responsible homeowners. But basically, you know, that's not everyone.
So we've been getting bombarded by these messages about homeownership gone wrong, homeownership's not right for everyone, and yet 80% of families headed by people between 25 and 45 want to become homeowners. 65% of people believe that the government has a role in making sure that financing is available for homeownership. So how do we reconcile these two kinds of competing messages and the processing of those things?
Yeah, I mean, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I think there's a graphic on your screen right there. I think the good news is, right? So we haven't been talking about good news much today, but there is some good news, right?
Let's
so
be a puppy upper.
Yeah, exactly, right. So the good news is that when you look at poll after poll after poll, you really do see that despite this barrage of negative media messages, you know, sort of American voters just haven't bought it, right? That they still overwhelmingly value homeownership. And you all see that in your work. I mean, I think this is a poll that's actually from January, just released, from the National Association of Home Builders. And, you know, to the point of what do people value about homeownership, when you really look at it, it's not about the sort of financial investment as much. It's not about the kind of the overall sort of jobs and economic security argument that we sometimes like to try and make. It's really about some very personal things to them, right? It's about a stable place for their family. It's about stable neighborhoods. And it is about the American dream, which I think folks still really think of homeownership as part of the American dream. But I will say that if we continue this barrage of negative messaging that goes unchallenged, you know, we're going to see an erosion of people's belief that homeownership is something to aspire to.
So how do we challenge this dominant message, and how do we actually kind of take back the narrative? One of the things we've been talking about is the fact that we've got kind of cacophony on our side of the ledger. We've got lots of people saying lots of different things that leads to a lot of confusion, while a simple, repeated message seems to have a lot of power.
Yeah.
So where should we be going in this space?
So, you know, I think one of the things that I want to really encourage folks to do, and actually I'm really curious, I've had a chance to talk to some of the folks here today, but not a lot of folks. Just by, I guess, clapping, can I just get a sense of how many of you is your organization or your you know, your institution, is there a kind of a focus, part of your focus is actually on communications and sort of outreach to, you know, through the media or through other channels to reach different audiences? Can you clap if that's part of your, okay. So
25, 30%?
Yeah, so about 30% of you. And how many of you are feeling like you're successful with your messages around sort of the value that homeownership will bring? A few people. Okay.
About half of
Okay, right. You know, I think that I think that there's a couple things that we could do, and you know, and I think Mac alluded to some of those, and I want to sort of, you know, suggest a couple of things. I think one is, you know, really understanding that right now that policymakers are looking at the media as a kind of window into what public opinion is. And I think that we are mistaken if we think that the policymakers are thinking about these polls that we've been sharing, that Americans actually think that homeownership is still part of the American dream. I think that often policymakers look at the media and see that as a window into what the American public really thinks, because they think that's what they're listening to and seeing. So one of our principal responsibilities in terms of a message is to really remind policymakers that, in fact, the vast majority of Americans still believe in homeownership as part of the American dream. And I think that that is one thing that we need to be reminding folks, because that message is definitely getting lost. It's not in the media, and it's not something that policymakers are reflecting back to us. And in fact, you know, some of the research that we did for you all and others, and I think we have some research to share around some of the interviews we've done with policymakers, is really kind of shows, I think if we could skip ahead one more slide. Oh, can I do it right here? All right. There we go. You know, one of the things that we have done is we've done sort of some interviews with some of the key champions, actually, people that were you know, not supportive in the past, but we did some interviews with some key champions on the Hill and in the administration who have really in the past been sort of at the forefront of promoting homeownership and finding solutions to homeownership. And one of the things that we're really finding is that there's been a real erosion among these policymakers, not just in their public statements, but actually in interviews that we've done with them, where they're saying, look, you know, we understand that homeownership is important, but it's clearly not for everyone. And it's not for everyone at this time. And you know, even when you look at, I think the next slide has the quote again from Obama, you know, this notion of, look, there are some responsible homeowners that we should be thinking about and protecting, but for everyone else, you know, now's not the time, or that's, you know, gotten us too far. Government doesn't have a role in that anymore. So I think with our messages, we need to kind of lift up and remind the policymakers, you know, what are the solutions, and that Americans themselves value homeownership, right?
So how important is it for policymakers to hear about programs that have succeeded in getting people into sustainable homeownership, even through this terrible recession that we've just come through?
I mean, I think it's terribly important, right? Because I think one of the things that we heard in our interviews with policymakers, and in fact, that we saw in the media coverage, is that the actual solutions are not getting out there. And I know you and I had a joke about this when I was sharing some of these interviews with you a while ago, but you know, I was saying the policymakers we've been talking to say, look, I keep hearing about all the problems, I want to know what the solutions are. And you know, I know you joking with me saying, you know, we talk about the solutions all the time, but maybe we talk about the solutions all the time, but folks aren't hearing it. So one of the things that I would really encourage is we think about how to frame our solutions in a way that lift them above a bunch of very specific kind of in-the-weeds proposals, and really think about a larger frame for what our solutions look like.
So what would a larger frame look like?
So actually today, as I was listening to Eric and some of the others, I actually kind of sketched out a new framing for some of our messages. So
a fresh new framing.
A fresh new frame, right?
Unveiled here today.
So here's something I'm going to toss out, and I would love for you all to be thinking about how you can really tap into the values that you're seeing from the audiences right now, and how to overcome these barriers, right, that we've been hearing about all day. And so I think if you were to use a message that would talk about a value saying, you know, Americans across the board agree that homeownership is still part of the American dream, when, you know, that we know when homeownership is strong, this nation is strong. And to overcome the barrier, rather than sort of repeating this mantra that, look, low-income people did not cause the homeownership crisis, which in fact just reinforces this notion of, well, did they or didn't they? You know, what's the evidence? I don't know. There seems to be confusion. I really love this terminology of, look, let's get back to the basics, right? Get back to the basics and put the middle class and those aspiring to the middle class first when it comes to the housing market, right? And you know, we need to make sure that Wall Street's runaway greed doesn't undo home ownership for everyone, and that across the country we have example after example of proven programs that have helped get families back into homes. And then to give people specifics. But this notion of, look, we have proven examples of getting people back into homes, and just really promote that overall kind of frame.
And I dare say in this room we have hundreds of proven examples of that. So, and one of the things that we've done is we've begun to compile these examples. We've reached out to housing finance agencies. We've reached out to large programs like the Self-Help Demonstration Program in North Carolina. We've got 150,000 examples of successful home ownership that have been facilitated by people in this room.
Great.
And they've performed as well or better than the prime fixed rate market. So, all right, so we've been asking you to write questions. We've had people combing the tables looking for questions. And I think Milt has a question for us. Milt, take it away.
All right, great. So for our first question with me, I have Maureen Rude, who is from NeighborWorks, Montana. Maureen, your question?
Well, you talked quite a bit about the media says that it's the low-income people who caused the crisis. Do you think that we need to do more to try to make the point that that's not what caused the crisis, and if so, how?
You know, I think that's a really great question. That's something that we've talked about before, too. I do think it's important to correct the record, but I just want to point out that if we continue to have a conversation about where the blame goes, we continue to have a conversation of what's wrong with housing and what's wrong with homeownership. And we really need to move a conversation to what's right with homeownership. And right now we are stuck in this negative spire of everything is wrong with homeownership, and we just need to move forward. So I think to the extent that when you're talking about solutions, that you can say, you know, look, we have proven examples of getting low-income buyers into houses and keeping them there, and then giving those solutions, and you're making that point. But let's get out of the negative cycle of really talking about sort of the problems with homeownership right now.
And it's interesting, one of the things I learned about communications from Keta Yoon and her staff is that if you're arguing with someone who's taken kind of an emotional position, you don't defeat an emotional position with facts.
No.
And so very often the way that you actually confront an emotional position someone has, well, you know, it's obvious that this happened, I feel this way about it, is with a story. And very often you animate a story that someone can connect to, or you animate it with an aspiration, and people can think differently about the claim they're making and change the way they feel, which is really the important thing.
Yeah, one thing they actually talk about framing, for those of you who've heard about framing, and a lot of times folks say, if the facts don't fit the frame in people's minds, they actually throw away the facts. So that is really something that's important to keep in mind.
Thanks. Milt, what do you got for us?
I have another question for you. All right, so for our second question, I have Kelly Kent here with our organizational division in NeighborWorks America out of Kansas City. Kelly, your question?
Thank you. I was wondering if you could give some feedback on how we create specific messages that resonate with the public.
Sure. So that's an easy question and a complicated answer. And I think one of the things to really keep in mind is when you're thinking about the messaging, first of all, it's really important to segment your audiences and really think about who you're targeting, right? So if we are trying to target the folks at HUD, for example, to think a little bit differently about the way they are designing their programs, or if we are trying to target a program out of the mayor's office in Chicago, for example. My guess is those two audiences have some very different values that they bring to this, and in fact have some very different barriers that you're trying to overcome. And so that's one of the reasons that we really encourage folks to really think very clearly about your audiences and what values you're trying to overcome. And I think what we're hearing a lot from policymakers is right now their barrier is that they just don't believe that things have been working. So you just need to go back to them with those solutions.
All right, so what do we got going on in the Twitter space, Tosin? Do we hear anything from the Twitter sphere?
Yes, actually we do have one question, and it reads, how do we as an industry keep the media honest on the home ownership narrative?
Well, that's another great question. I have to say that there are a number of different things that you can do. So first of all, again, when we did this media scan, one of the things that we really are seeing is missing are the voices of practitioners and advocates. So I think one of the first things that you can do is to really, as much as possible, reach out to your local media and your regional media and actually Let them know the kind of expertise that you bring. Let them know that you have real life stories of things that are working, and actually offer to share your stories with them, because I think in some cases the media are kind of taking the easy negative stories and not, just don't know who to be talking to. I think the second thing is when you find that there is a story that is sort of negative or has taken the wrong tack, I think it's really important for us to really think of ourselves as, in some ways, media watchdogs, right? So that we really, I mean, I worked at a local paper in New Mexico, and I know that we got calls all the time. And I would say, go in and say, look, you ran this story. I want to tell you a different perspective. How can we get that perspective into the next story? Can I write an op-ed? What can I do? And I just want to really encourage you. You're so busy. There's so much that you're doing. But really think about, if you want that narrative to change, you know, we all of us here have to commit to spending a little bit of time trying to get that out there.
So one of the things that we're doing is part of our work around promoting homeownership, and we've been linking up with campaigns like the Home for Good campaign that National Council of La Raza is doing. We've begun to assemble a story bank with case studies of successful homeownership programs that we'll be happy to distribute among this audience, and I think we'll probably do it through the aegis of NeighborWorks America. But we're also working with Ketiyun and with Opportunity Agenda to develop some messages that, and we're going to provide those messages to people who can begin to create the buzz out in the field with the same messages that are targeted to specific audiences. But we're hoping that we can create enough of an echo that we can begin to build a movement around homeownership as a pathway to the middle class, homeownership as an asset building strategy for low-income people, but buttressed by sound research, good case studies, and real stories about real people who have succeeded in homeownership in spite of the difficulties of the last 5 or 6 years. So what are your next steps? How are you going to be able to keep track of what's going on out in the media space? Of course, with our support.
Right. I mean, I think we're going to continue to really kind of track what's going on. I would really love to talk to more folks today to really hear about what are your experiences, what are the messages that you're using, where do you feel like you want to get more traction. And I just want to say that I'm here today and I would love to talk to more folks and to do that. I think that, as Mac mentioned, the more that we can promote solutions, but all talk in the same frame, that if you really think about it, right now there's a story being told, and there are heroes and there are villains, and someone else has put that story together right now, right? And what I want to do is together, you know, make sure that we're all promoting the same heroes and not make those villains low-income borrowers that you all are working with.
Okay, so I urge you to keep in touch with us, and through NeighborWorks we're going to be continuing this campaign over the next, well, for as long as it takes. And we're going to make sure that we kind of reinvigorate the policy to get homeownership to be a reality for lots of the low-income people that we care about, and to find ways for us to participate in sustainable long-term homeownership for all the people we care about. So thanks, Ketiyun, and hopefully you're going to stick around. People have a chance to chat you up about some of the other stuff you're doing. And I think right now we're going to go to Tosin for some comments from the Twitter space. What do we got, Tosin?
We have a variety of comments coming in. One reads, "We need to change the conversation. I agree. There needs to be a focus on what's right with home ownership and not a focus on what's wrong with it." Another tweet reads, "This is beneficial information to revitalize home ownership." We also have another tweet that reads, "Home ownership has to be better marketed as a good investment. Buyers still don't want to catch a falling knife." Thank you.
All right, so we've heard a lot about kind of, and thank you, Ketiyun. So we've heard a lot about kind of all the difficulties that people face in becoming homeowners in this really crazy market, getting financing, finding homes, being able to qualify for loans, and yet people are still buying houses. Well, this is interesting. So some people are buying houses, and our friend from the National Association of Realtors, Paul Bishop, is here to tell us a little bit, a picture of who are the first-time home buyers that we're seeing in the market today. And the question that we want to ask ourselves is, if this is a picture of the first-time home buyer right now, how do we want to change that picture? So Paul, what do first-time home buyers look like right now?
I think it's good to take a step back, and we've mentioned this earlier about how important first-time home buyers are to the market, but just to give you a sense of where we're at relative to the past few years, Before the crisis that we saw in housing and the financial crisis, home ownership among first-time buyers is about 40%, or 40% share of all buyers were first-time buyers. And that rose a little bit when we had the tax credits, and since then it's been down in the upper 30% range. So it's fallen off from what it was. But the real importance of that is not just that there are fewer first-time buyers in the market, as those numbers suggest, but it's also the fact that first-time buyers really have a particularly strong effect on the market. Because if you think about the home sale transaction, if I own a home and want to sell a home, there has to be someone on the other end of the transaction to buy that. So if in fact there are fewer first-time buyers in the market, then that means not just that there are fewer transactions from that extent, but also that other sellers, other people in the market looking to do a transaction will have a more difficult time as well. So that's one of the things we've been seeing in terms of the market overall. And so one of the things that we do to track not only the first-time buyers but the housing market overall is we do an annual survey of home buyers and sellers, and we ask them about their experience in terms of the process, who they are, some demographics. And one of the things that allows us to do is really focus on first-time buyers. And I have a few slides here to really give you a picture of who first-time buyers are and maybe emphasize some of the points we've already discussed a little earlier today, but to put some numbers with it in terms of what first-time buyers are seeing in the market at this point and their experience as buyers as we come out of the financial crisis and what their views about the housing market are. So if we could take a look at some of those slides.
Does it work? Yep.
There we go. As I said, we do a survey every year, and here's just some basic characteristics of who the first-time buyers are. And I won't go through all of these in a great deal of detail, except to say that the typical first-time buyer is about 31 years old. That has not changed much over the last few years. The majority of those are, of course, in their late 20s, early 30s. One of the things that we have seen change quite a bit over the last few years, or last decade or so, is really the percentage of first-time buyers that are foreign-born or that are among one of several racial minorities. That went from single digits not that many years ago in both cases to, as you see here, 15% of first-time home buyers are foreign-born and about a quarter are one of several racial minorities. And so that is one of the biggest trends we've seen over the last several years, and obviously that trend I think will continue for the foreseeable future. And in terms of income, the typical first-time buyer has a median income of about $62,000, and of course that varies a lot from one area of the country to the next, but that should give you some sense when you think about first-time buyers, really who they are in terms of their demographics and the characteristics, again, of the typical first-time buyer here.
So we have a first-time buyer with a median household income of around $62,000. Right now, the median income for households in the U.S. is around 50, right? So that would say that the average household that's the first-time home buyer is about 120% of the median income. How does that compare to the first-time home buyers over the past 5 or 10 years? Is that a higher income bracket or a lower income bracket?
What we've seen in terms of income of first-time buyers is over the last several years, it's actually gone up. And that there's a good news, bad news side to that in the sense that first-time buyers' income is increasing, but the reason it's increasing is that only the people who actually purchase a home are reflected in the numbers you see here. So over time, it's those who are successful in higher income, and we've seen that in particular over the last couple of years, are the ones who are able to complete the process to buy a home. So it is often the case that you can imagine that many potential first-time buyers are, for whatever reason, dissuaded from even pursuing the process or for whatever reason can't complete the process. So the people who are in the market, successful in terms of buying a home, are actually higher income first-time buyers than we've seen over the last few years.
So one thing that jumps out at me here is that you noted that a lot more foreign-born, a lot more racial minorities are first-time home buyers than in the past. But in the United States, 75% of white non-Hispanic Americans are homeowners, and 50% of racial minorities or less, 47% of African Americans, 49 or so percent of Hispanic Americans are homeowners. And if we only get 25% of racial minorities as first-time home buyers, we're going to do nothing to close the racial homeownership gap.
It's going to take a very long time, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the first-time buyer share of all transactions is down from what it was. So we're talking about a smaller number of transactions as well as a small representation among those transactions.
So what else can you tell us?
We've also discussed earlier in terms of why people buy a home, and none of these reasons should not come as a surprise to anyone. We ask, what is the top reason that you want to become or why do you want to become a homeowner? And the top reason if one has to choose a single reason, it's simply the desire to be a homeowner. And we've heard that many times already today, and given where we've been through, that is a relatively strong number, I would say. And again, the investment aspect of buying a home is certainly there as well, although it's not the dominant reason that many people say they want to buy a home. But we did some first-time buyer focus groups a while ago, and this, I think, is an even better statement than the numbers themselves. And one of the focus group participants said, "I think the best part of receiving my key, walking in and feeling the sense of accomplishment, I've reached the next step in my life." So these were recent focus groups. So these were first-time buyers who were well aware of the financial commitment that it took to buy a home. They'd seen what had been going on with the economy and the recession, but yet they still had this view that it was the next step in their life, that purchase of a first home.
So certainly a signifier of success, and it used to be one of the signifiers of entry into the middle class. And now we hear, well, maybe people are recalibrating what they think about going into the middle class, but let's hope not, right?
One other participant in that focus group said in a fairly casual manner, when I bought my home, now I was an adult, meaning that they had reached that milestone where they could look at themselves as having accomplished that first substantial step in being an adult.
Well, given the statistic that only 70% of first-time home buyers were previously renters, sounds like a lot of them are moving out of mom and dad's houses. 23% are leaving mom and dad, right? So they are moving up.
That's right.
They're moving out.
So one of the other aspects of the survey that we look at very closely is how do buyers get the information that they need to be successful when purchasing a home? And again, all of this information is specific to first-time buyers. And so one of the things that we look at is what do first-time buyers do first? So you can imagine a scenario where there's a potential first-time buyer, they're thinking about buying a home, they're not really sure about the process, what they should do first. So what, among these group of first-time buyers that we've surveyed, what did they do first? So we asked among this group, what did you do first? And so we have the top 3 reasons. So many buyers, of course, do many things to get information from lots of different sources, but what was the first thing that buyers did? And the very first thing that the majority of buyers said they did was they looked online for property. So you can imagine, you know, some evening sitting around curious about this particular neighborhood, what the prices are and so forth. The next thing they did, if they wanted information or were a little unsure about the process, contact a real estate agent. Or the third most frequent thing that they said they did is the first thing was to look online for some information about the buying process, keeping in mind these are first-time buyers, so they haven't had the benefit of having been through this transaction before.
And I'm sure that a lot of people in this room are really, really upset about this quote on the right. Few buyers are going to home buying seminars or reading guides about the home buying process.
Right, and when you put this question in context about the first thing that buyers did, it's clear that home buying seminars and those types of activities aren't at the top of mind for most first-time buyers. It doesn't mean that they won't necessarily at some point get some more information through a home buying seminar, but it's not the first thing that most buyers think of when they think about the process of going forward with buying a home. Instead, it's about looking for properties and what's the next step in the process, even though many may not be ready to take that next step until they've had some further background, further education through a buying seminar.
So Paul, given that we have people in the room here who have a real interest in actually changing the demographics and the configuration of the first-time homebuyer population, how would you see them kind of partnering or working with realtors to kind of make that happen?
Well, you can see from the information here that the 2 most frequent places that buyers go to get information is either online or their local real estate agent. And to give you one example that in terms of how realtors serve as a conduit for information is that a number of state and local realtor associations have consumer-facing websites. And so on those websites there's information about the buying process, anything that may be unique or particular to that local area, but also information about down payment assistance, closing cost assistance. So I would say that if you want to make sure that more first-time buyers have buying information as the top of mind, the first thing that they do through either home buying seminars or through some other source, you really have to go where the buyers are. And clearly, the 2 places where buyers are online or through that personal connection with a realtor who can be that conduit for information.
So where do you see the first-time home buyers, you know, the configuration of first-time home buyers going? Is it going to be relatively stable? You see a different composition of home buyers as we move into kind of a new world of majority-minority population, a very different kind of age configuration. Is it going to change, or?
I think it'll change for a couple of reasons. First, there's the demographic reasons that you alluded to, and we've seen that over the last few years in terms of the racial makeup of the typical first-time buyer. But one of the other things, and this is a concern that I have, is that in terms of the unemployment picture that we talked about earlier today, I don't think we necessarily fully appreciate the ramifications of that going forward, especially for the first-time buyer segment. You know, in the first slide, I said that the typical age for someone to buy their first home is about 31 years old. What that's usually driven by is a life event or a desire to be a homeowner at some stage in a person's career. They've graduated from school, maybe have a job that they feel is fairly stable. So now the next step in order to become that adult, as that one focus group participant said, was to buy a home. But when you look at the unemployment numbers for those people in the 25 to 34 year age category, so that's the prime first-time buyer category, and you see the stresses that they are on in terms of the economy, there is a real concern that a lot of potential first-time buyers who would normally buy at the age of, say, 30, 31 are going to be pushed off that typical trajectory, given that a lot of the buyers in that cohort right now, or potential buyers, are under a great deal of financial and economic stress.
So what are we buying here?
So in terms of what buyers are buying, it's clear that first-time buyers, more urban in terms of the setting than repeat buyers, less suburban. That probably doesn't come as much of a surprise. But one of the things I really want to point out is what first-time buyers will compromise on and what they won't. In terms of looking at the home and the things that they say they will compromise on, things that they are least likely to compromise on in terms of the particular property that they're looking at are distance from family and friends, the quality of the neighborhood, and the quality of the schools. And this really touches on some larger research that's been done in terms of the preferences of younger people and their desire to be in a community that fits them, has the activities that they want, with the decision to buy or rent coming second. So it's the community first, and then the decision to buy or rent, or to continue renting if they're already renters, as the way that a lot of the potential first-time buyers are viewing the decision about where to live and whether or not to purchase a home. But overall, buyers are a lot more flexible when it comes in terms of price, condition, style of home. So it's not necessarily the view that they have the ideal picture of the home they want. It's more about the community they want to be in, and then make the decision about what type of home and what type of tenure they want to choose.
So we heard earlier from Lori Gay about Palmdale, where people were driving till they qualified so they could get affordable housing, and they would commute 90 minutes to work. You think, is that a thing of the past, or is this something that we're going to have to worry about again, where people are going to be going as far out as they can just to find something affordable with maybe some decent schools?
I think it's going to be more on a community-by-community basis, because those communities that are growing and growing relatively robustly are still going to have those same types of pressures. But for those communities that have been hit particularly hard by the housing crisis, or where the job situation is a little bit weaker, we may see some change in terms of how that dynamic plays out. So there may be some overall change in terms of how various metropolitan areas adjust over time, but it'll probably be something along those lines.
All right, so now we'll hear a little bit about where homeownership counseling could be really, really helpful in making the process better for buyers to navigate.
And it's clear for any of us who've been through the purchase of a home that buying homes is a pretty complicated process. And again, we ask home buyers, and in this case particularly first-time home buyers, about what they found difficult about the process. And when we asked what were the most difficult steps, certainly finding a home was number one. I mean, for all the reasons we just mentioned in terms of either the characteristics of the community or the home itself. But then there's the two process questions in terms of understanding the process overall. Where do they get that information? Do they understand that information? Are they simply relying on a family member who may or may not have all the best information about the process? And then, of course, all the paperwork that goes along with that is one of the more difficult steps that first-time buyers point to. You know, one of the other aspects of the difficulty from first-time buyers' perspective is a large number of first-time buyers don't have a sense of how long they want to be in the home. So when they're making decisions or thinking about what type of home, there's kind of an open-ended question: am I going to be in this home for 2 or 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years? So that makes the decision a little bit more difficult. And not surprisingly, the other difficulty that most first-time buyers find is the mortgage process. And we've heard about that time and time again. And 42% found the process difficult, but this is an environment where everybody knows that the mortgage process is difficult to some degree or another, and still 4 in 10 found that it was even more difficult with all that information, more difficult than they anticipated. And that really boils down into one of the frustrations of the focus group members who said, we had fun in the beginning, and then when everything started, when we got real serious about it, that's when it got stressful and was more than what we expected in terms of that level of stress.
Yeah, it's always fun until somebody gets hurt, huh?
Exactly.
Yes. All right, so I think we're going to go to Milt. Milt, what do we got for questions from the audience?
All right, with me I have Erica Torres, who is the Executive Director for Haven Neighborhood Services. Erica, your question.
My question is that what is the the National Association of Realtors doing to partner with housing counseling agencies? Since we're a very important asset to housing, we want to know what you are trying to, if you are trying to do it, what is it that you will be, or you're working on something to partner with us to make the partnership easier? We should work in a conjunction together to make homeownership easier and more understandable for some of the borrowers. Since we are a little bit more housing counseling agency, we're closer to the borrowers, and sometimes they trust us more than they trust their realtor, especially now with this economy that they don't trust realtors because they have been damaged by them. So is there anything that you are doing right now or you're planning to do to do a partnership with us?
Well, we have a number of outreach efforts, and these cover a lot of different areas. And in fact, we compiled a volume of different outreach efforts among the associations across each of the states. And there was some activity across every association in every state. There was an outreach to, say, to help with employer-assisted housing, community outreach in terms of lending, finding about information about down payment assistance and closing costs. So there are a number of activities that not only the National Association is involved with, but also the state and local associations. And so in those communities that you're working, if you haven't already contacted the realtors in your community and the state and local association in your community, I would urge you to do so, because I think in virtually all cases they would be very happy to work with you in terms of, again, being that conduit for information if that's appropriate, or taking a more active role in terms of partnering in community outreach.
Just a quick clap for how many of you work for counseling agencies that have had good relationships with local realtors that have kind of worked together to help get people into homeownership successfully? So there you go. It's already working. This is probably another story we should be telling. Milt, what do you got?
Okay, great. With me I have Barb Worley, who is out of NeighborWorks Anchorage. Barb, your question?
My question is, how do we get the message out in a better fashion with regard to the value of home buyer education and counseling?
Yeah, that really touches on two things. First, as we saw in the earlier discussion about how to communicate and how to get the message out and what the message should be. But I think the data that we have here suggests that, at least at this point, first-time buyers, at the point when it's most critical, don't see the value proposition. Why should I go to a housing education seminar? Why should I engage in housing counseling? The value there isn't seen up front. It may be seen, sometime later, wishing they would have done something along those lines. But at this point, the value proposition up front is really not being seen. So I think there's a pretty substantial communication effort that's necessary to show why it is of value, and to make sure that through all of those channels we talked about earlier, online, through real estate professionals, other people that touch the potential first-time buyer early in the process, have the information that they need so they can convey that value proposition, that value message to first-time buyers who might benefit from some type of counseling.
And another thing that we really need to think about is how we describe what we do. And sometimes describing ourselves as counselors gives an indication to people that they're somehow defective and they need our help. So maybe we should think about, and maybe we should get Ketayun to help us with this, think about how better to describe what we do. Because we're not just counseling people, what we're doing is we're educating, we're preparing, we're doing a lot of things to make people successful homeowners, and we might want to brand ourselves a little bit differently. And we have time for one more from, Milt? What do you got, Milt?
Okay, great. So I have Joan Carty here from the Housing Development Fund out of Stamford, Connecticut. Joan, your question?
How do we challenge the perception of real estate agents, some real estate agents, who feel that government-assisted or nonprofit programs slow the buyer down?
Yeah. We hit a nerve there.
Yeah. So I guess it goes back to really telling the story and telling the story about the value of government assistance and how the realtors and the entire housing community is a value to that desire or value to that first-time buyer in terms of moving them forward in the process here. So again, a lot of this goes back to an effective communication message, and it's a difficult thing to tackle, but I think that's probably the most important way to get that message out as effectively as possible.
So let's see, Tosin, do we have anything going on in the Twitter space? Any questions?
Yes, we have quite a bit of activity actually. I have two questions, and I'm actually going to go ahead and combine them because I think they're sort of the same. So we have Chad Clareweather, I believe is how I say that, asks, how will the popular shift towards renting affect our neighborhood's ability to compete for strong residents? Then Lindsay Martin from New Orleans then tweets, how do we increase awareness of the home buying process to first-time home buyers in an area that is in recovery? So I think it's about the same. How do we market to those that are living in areas that may have been impacted a lot by the homeownership crisis?
So I'm going to tell you just a quick story because this is really interesting. We do a lot of work in Detroit, and in Detroit, they've had lots of trouble with recovering neighborhoods. And a neighborhood in Detroit called Historic Boston Edison, which is one of the neighborhoods that is surviving quite well, the residents of the neighborhood formed their own residents association, and they began to market their neighborhood, and they began to find ways to bring people in to buy homes in their neighborhood. They found the homes, they marketed the homes, and they talked about how they worked together to make their neighborhood a successful neighborhood, including the Neighborhood Watch, a whole bunch of other things. So it was an interesting thing that they did.
And I think that touches on one very important aspect of the process, is that a lot of the aspects of any type of transaction are really based on a personal relationship, whether it's with your neighbor, whether it's with some other member in the community, whether it's with a realtor, in terms of not only conveying the information about the transaction, but conveying the value of why this community is a place I should look to perhaps live, or what the nature of the community is in terms of a recovering community, why the residents are excited about being in this community. All of that probably is a pretty effective way of overcoming some of that difficulty in terms of those neighborhoods that are recovering but not yet maybe in the top of mind or the awareness of those potential first-time buyers.
So I think we've got some more activity in the Twitter space. Tosin, what do you got for us?
Yes, so I have a final question here, and it asks, what is the NAR Public Awareness TV campaign about, and how is that campaign going?
We have an ongoing public awareness campaign, and several months ago it really shifted directions, and some of you may have seen the latest version of some of the television commercials that really focuses on the threats to home ownership, or the fact that home ownership is being threatened by lots of potential policy decisions down the road, and the view of home ownership versus renting. And so that's going to be continuing for the foreseeable future, and in fact there will be a different and new updated set of public awareness ads that I believe will be debuted in June. So the ads themselves will be updated and a little bit different, but the whole thrust of the campaign toward highlighting the potential threats to home ownership will be continuing.
Well, that's great. Well, I really want to thank you for sharing all the data with us and sharing the opportunity to work with the National Association of Realtors, and I'm sure that there's many of us who will want to continue to build on those relationships and work together. And I think we're going to toss it to Tosin for some comments from Twitter Space and move on to our next guests. So thanks.
Thank you.
So we have a couple of comments. I believe the first two comments are still referencing the previous segment we had, but I'm just going to go ahead and share them anyway. Lindsay J. Martin from New Orleans tweets, positive messaging is critical, especially in markets that are recovering like New Orleans. Center Bros Housing in Baltimore, Maryland tweets, what messages work? What are the sound bites? Give us the research, focus groups, case studies. The Westside NHS in Buffalo, New York tweets, we've seen first-time buyers needing more credit and financial counseling over the last few years. We have Hope Home Foundation in Las Vegas tweets, employer-assisted housing is starting to work in our area. And then we also have Marcia Nedland of Fall Creek Consultants. She tweets, sustainable model for home ownership has to be lighter, quicker, and cheaper. It's time to fully embrace web education. Today's buyers use the web. Thank you.
In the data, a lot of people using the web as their first point of contact to look at homes, to figure out, to get information about how to be homeowners, and it's something I know that many of us in the room have learned to use to our advantage as well for delivering homeownership education and also for getting out to people in distant areas. In fact, something we're going to hear about in 1 minute. All right, so we've talked a little bit about how we talk about ourselves, the messages we build around homeownership. We've talked a little bit about the demand side of the market. What's going on the demand side and how we need to think about changing the demand side if we can by reaching a different audience for homeownership. And now let's turn for a minute to think about how we do our business. And part of how we do our business is the models, the business models we build around our own enterprises that we're going to use to build strong, sustainable homeownership for people. And then how do we really find new alliances, new partnerships that can really facilitate our ability to take the work we're doing to scale, mindful of the fact that there's a lot of people in the world who don't get what we do. I know many of you share the same experiences that I share when you go home at, say, Thanksgiving and you try to explain to your families what you do. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, the test, the Aunt Lucy test or the mom test. How do we actually figure out the right way to explain what we do, and how do we actually get people to aspire to the same kind of values and aspirations that we have? So we have a couple of Gregs here, and we're going to hear first from Greg Hancock from WIN, the Wyoming Housing Network, and then we're going to hear from Greg Schiffelbein from Opportunity Finance Network, two consummate networkers, I would say. And so the first thing we're going to hear about is actually a statewide effort to partner with the Housing Finance Agency to provide homeownership counseling and to actually become the biggest producer in the NeighborWorks network. Is that what I understand? You guys are the big ones. So Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on in WIN and what you're doing in Wyoming?
Sure. We, as you mentioned, Mac, have a good partnership with the State Finance Agency in Wyoming, and that partnership is between the Wyoming Housing Network, a NeighborWorks organization that operates statewide in Wyoming, and the Wyoming Community Development Authority, the State Finance Agency in the state. In that relationship, one component of our partnership is that WCDA is contracted with the Wyoming Housing Network for the delivery of homebuyer education and counseling or coaching services. We, as you mentioned, in the last 3 years have educated and coached over 900 people, and we have created, as a result of the educational and coaching process, an average of 700 homebuyers each year, with 2 staff.
With 2 staff?
Correct.
And so what share of the market is that for Wyoming or for the Housing Finance Agency?
WCDA is very aggressive in their marketing and serves 35% of the market.
So you cover 35% of the market in the state and apparently 100% of the HFA's market because they send all their clients to you for counseling or education and preparation. Let's get away from the counseling term.
Well, WCDA for years has recognized the value of homebuyer education. And they've been tracking loan performance for the last 10 years, and they're seeing that their loans perform very well, and 1.5% roughly are 120 days delinquent, only 1.5%. So initially they started with just requiring homebuyer ed, but as time went on, and within the last 14 months, are now requiring both education and the coaching. And a strong position to take, but in their words and in our collective words, it's the right thing to do to prepare people for responsible homeownership.
So we heard before that the first point of contact for lots of people is on the internet when they think about buying a house. Tell us how you're using technology to actually get out to people, because your state is pretty big and you have 2 people working for you.
And it's very rural. Our population density is less than 6 people per square mile. 560,000 people. Communities are more than 100 miles apart often. So we've had to find some way to cross the miles and avoid the expense of having staff in multiple locations. So we, under contract with WCDA, in June of 2009, initiated a partnership including eHome America, a web-based homebuyer education program formed by a NeighborWorks organization based in Kentucky, WCDA and WIN staff and some regional NeighborWorks staff all partnered to kind of fine-tune and unveil the, in Wyoming, the online education component, and it's working very well. We follow that, Mac, with one-on-one coaching.
So you have two people who are able to cover the whole state with one-on-one coaching? And how do they do that?
We use telephone. We use...
well, there's an old technology.
You know, I should say, I know a lot of the NeighborWorks organizations have been delivering homebuyer education and counseling or coaching for a number of years, and in Wyoming, we didn't have any historic model to change from. So for us to come in and start fresh, we were able to look at what would really work to serve the needs in the state. And what WCDA had used in the past was a compressed video delivery model where people would come once or twice a month from wherever they lived, converge on 10 to 12 different locations, spend 5-6 hours in a day completing the homebuyer education. And that worked very well, but beginning in June of 2009, we rolled out the online education, and we didn't really know exactly how people would react. We didn't, you know, we knew that the first-time homebuyer in Wyoming is typically 32 years old, a year older than the national, but nonetheless, a population that's very comfortable with technology, very comfortable with online interaction. And so we simultaneously ran the system that WCDA had creatively employed to bridge the miles, the compressed video delivery. We ran that for 6 months, parallel with online education. And in a couple of months, it really became obvious that people loved online education. The kids go to bed, they can knock out a module, they can stay at home, they don't have to take time off work and lose pay, they don't have to pay a babysitter. And the way that program is structured, people are tested at the end of each module to be sure that they actually understand it. Another thing that clients like about it is that they can go in and out at their own pace. They can learn at their own pace. So when they're ready to learn is when it's available to them. So
you've moved away from the model with the compressed video, and you're doing it solely now online, and it's working great.
It's working very well. And then the second part then, the one-on-one consultation, we contact the client when they sign up for eHome America. We inform them of the full process. So we have that interaction with the clients telephonically. We refer them to our website. We send them a one-on-one package. So prior to the one-on-one consultation, they've done their homework. They've prepared their household budget. They've prepared a list of questions that they have about the home buying process that's unique to them. And so when we talk to them, they're sitting there looking at their homework, and we're on the phone or using Skype and talking with them about the same things. So Mac, you know, we're looking at your income, or we're looking at those things, and so it's a virtual presence, and it works very well.
All right, so let's talk about the business model then, because you've found a way, apparently, to actually pay for this, which is, in some ways, the holy grail for many people in the room. How do they pay for their homeownership training and education programs? So tell us a little bit about the business model underneath what you're doing.
Our contract with WCDA is one where they pay us 1/4 point of the loan amount at closing. And given the volume of home buyers that they extend loans to every year, and given the fact that they require homebuyer education and coaching prior to closing, we generate through that contract an average of $250,000 a year. And that does cover our operating costs and has immensely helped stabilize a fairly young organization. WIN, Wyoming Housing Network, was formed in 2005. So here we are 7 years later. And the partnership with WCDA and the steady income provides us a base to reach out and perform additional services and pursue the development of affordable housing in a state that has been underserved in that arena as well for many years.
Although the homeownership rate in Wyoming is actually quite high relative to the national average, isn't that right?
70%. It's eroded a little bit in the last couple of years to the upper 60s, but pretty high.
So, you know, when you think of the value of your homeownership preparation, the training, the education that you give, you cited the fact that these mortgages perform better on average than way better on average than the average market, because we're talking about, you know, delinquency rates in the U.S. that are hovering around 10%, and you're talking about a book that has delinquency rates in the 1.5% range. But is there any other value that you see to the training that is often missed out there? And this is a rhetorical question, so if you don't know, I'm going to tell you what it is.
How about I take a shot at an answer, and then maybe you can augment that answer. You know, I think part of what really makes this partnership work, and I think this gets at your question or your comment, is that in the home buying process, there really are three parties that are involved. One is the home buyer. Obviously, a second one, particularly to all of us here in the room, is an entity that can help educate and prepare that borrower to make the right home choice, to buy a home they can afford, to manage their money well, and to be comfortable and confident with their home purchase. The third party in this equation is the banker, is the entity with the money, is the lender. And so when the borrower starts the idea of wanting to buy a home, and if they can engage with an entity like the Wyoming Housing Network using online education, and like Paul said, people are going online to start looking for a home, well, linking that to the education, then their anxiety is reduced. Some of the emotionalism of home purchase is tempered by the realities of the process and how to prepare and how much can I afford and so on, so that when in the movement from the home buyer through the educator and coach to the lender, there's a continuum that works well, and there's greater comfort, and hence then at the end we have a home buyer that's much more stable in their home.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, but I'm going to throw a curveball to our production staff, because I want to ask a question to somebody here in the audience who's given a lot of thought into the business model behind homeownership counseling and education. So Milt, I know you have Mike Lofton over there, and if you could get Mike ready, I'm going to tell you the rhetorical answer to the question I just asked, because what's really interesting about homeownership training, counseling, is that a lot of people claim that the value of it is in how mortgages perform, but actually homeownership counseling started from marketing. Homeownership counseling started from the need for CRA lenders to find their way to serve new customers they had no history in working with. And most of the early homeownership pre-purchase counseling was designed to help them find creditworthy borrowers in markets that they hadn't served for decades. So think about it. What role does homeownership, or could homeownership education, training, and preparation play at expanding the market, not just in preparing people who are already going to be coming to the market? And that's a value proposition that we haven't been able to really put forward. So Mike, we've been working for years with you in HomeWise in Santa Fe, and I want to talk a little bit about, you have a different approach to how you're going to fund your homeownership program, and you've also done it in partnership with your HFA and others. Could you just tell us a little bit quickly about your approach and what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think we focus on an integrated home purchase model, not just because of funding it, but in terms of providing a better value proposition for the customer. So I think a big part of the problem here is that our language is not good. And you pointed this out earlier, that counseling, isn't really what we're talking about here. Counseling, it becomes the goal. It's not the goal. I prefer to call it homebuyer preparation. But even just the homebuyer preparation to create a successful, strong buyer and a new buyer to build demand, which I think is really important, it's not enough just to prepare them and then say, go out into the world and find a house, good luck, and good luck getting a good mortgage. I wonder how many people went through homebuyer education and ended up getting a subprime loan anyway. So I think we need to be thinking about a smart home purchase process that's integrated from the point of entry, where we're assessing what the buyer can do, helping them discern whether it makes sense to buy a home, getting them ready to buy a home. That part's the counseling part. But then we need to be there too when they're picking a home, so they get the right home that's not a lemon, that they can truly afford it, it's in their purchasing power, and they get the right finance. And I think we need to be with them through the entire process. So we have done that and built that model. Our delinquency rate is less than Fannie Mae's prime conventional rate, even though they're low down payments, typically less than 2%. First-time home buyers, lower income, they outperform the best of the mortgage market, where a fourth of FHA's delinquency rate. So I think in terms of delivering higher value to the customer, I think having that integrated approach really works.
So more than just delivering higher value to the customer, though, you've built this integrated system that also brings revenue to you. So
that's right.
How has that system worked to deliver revenue to your bottom line at HomeWise?
So we have real estate agents that are paid salaries that help people find a home. We're a mortgage bank that help people get the right financing. This last year, 98% of our operating expenses were covered by fee revenue.
That's great. 98% of your operating expenses are covered by fees that you earn in that, which is a fabulous model and something that I think that we should probably learn more from. Once again, telling our own stories is always kind of a better way to go. And one of the things that we might need to think about is how do we find other sources of revenue to kind of buttress the model. So thanks, Mike. And I'm sure you're going to be around for people to kind of bend your ear about what you're doing in Santa Fe. So I know I threw a curveball to our production staff, so are we going to questions? Okay, Milt, what do you got for us over on the question booth?
All right, so I have the lovely Donna Talley here with us from NeighborWorks America out of our Southern District doing work in the Gulf. Donna, your question?
Yes, you talked about this high volume model, and it seems that it's the HFA, certainly in your state, is recognizing the value that you bring and that you are essentially you are a machine that generates mortgage-ready buyers. And I was wondering, to what extent are you capturing the 4 generally accepted metrics, the effect that you're having on these 4 metrics: debt, incomes, savings, and credit? And the second part of my question is, to what extent might we replicate this model with HFAs and other partners and be a catalyst for bringing back the housing market?
Well, I would first say, let me address the second part first, in terms of a model and of a relationship between an HFA and a NeighborWorks organization that could be replicated in other places. I would say, I used the term earlier, a natural partnership. An HFA certainly is a lender, a mortgage lender, and in Wyoming, WCDA does more than just that. But they're also altruistically motivated. So the function of an HFA is not just that of a bank or just that of a lender. Part of their mission is accomplished by helping to support the Wyoming Housing Network and its effectiveness. It is also accomplished by providing homebuyer education to all borrowers rather than just their own, and through the availability of the online that we talk about. In terms of your first part then, and that was in regard to how we impact credit and debt and savings and so on, we're actually looking at the home buying process in 2 different steps. The second step is the one that actually is kind of the final step that would lead to home ownership. And yes, we work with clients, if needed, in multiple cases on the coaching side to bring them to the point that they're credit ready, down payment ready and ready to make the closing on their home. Second phase that we are now rolling out is one that's, again, with NABWRK support, is more of a financial literacy, financial capability model that takes households that are at a lower than mortgage-ready credit level and works with them over a longer period of time to bring them to the point where they are homebuyer ready. So we see it as two different phases to reach the ultimate objective of a buyer that's ready, willing, and able to buy a home, and a lender that's ready to do the same.
So I think we have a follow-up for that question, Milt. Is there a follow-up here?
I have another question.
Oh, you have another question. Okay, so who else do you have for us for questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. With me, I have Christopher Hudek out of Boulder, Colorado. And Christopher, your question?
I have two questions. The first is, and this may be on the mind of many housing counselors and agencies, is how do you service homeowners without internet access?
You know, it's almost surprising how high the percentage of computer owners and internet access that there is actually available. We own and operate an affordable housing rental project in Wyoming, in Casper, that earn 50% and below a very median income, and over 90% of those tenants have computers. So in those rare instances that someone does not have computer access, either through the realtor's office, through the library, through their own home, or through, say, the home of a friend, then they can come to our office or they can contact us and make other arrangements. But we have never turned anyone away from the delivery of homebuyer education and coaching due to the lack of computer access or internet access. Not once.
Christopher, your second question?
Thank you. So I think what's on a lot of minds of counselors when you talk about the incredible high volume that you're doing with the two counselors, very impressive, is what techniques are you using, or at least your counselors are using, to have timely, efficient, and effective counseling session? And what's the duration of that counseling session?
The educational component takes 6 to 8 hours. The coaching component takes roughly 90 minutes. There are several quality control components in the entire education and coaching process. By having standardized education online that's able to be accessed repeatedly by the potential home buyer, that's a standard that's consistent with national industry standards. It's based on NABWRK's Realizing the American Dream. So that's a very high quality standard. We, the Wyoming Housing Network, is a HUD-approved housing counseling agency. We have a standard set of questions and criteria that's, again, consistent with national industry standards that we use, that we implement. And we also do pre-tests and post-tests to make sure that the clients are learning the information. Some of that is built into eHome America. Some of that is in addition that we add ourselves. We also do evaluations after the education is completed and the coaching is completed, asking the clients, how was this for you? Did you learn what you needed to learn? How was our staff? So we heed and respond to the suggestions that we get. But I will tell you that 97 to 99% of the evaluations are excellent.
Great, Greg. So now, all right, so we're going to shift this around a little bit now. We're going to take you outside of the homeownership space to once again think a little bit differently about how you put your business together, how you communicate what you do, and how you actually think about taking your work to scale. We're going to talk to Greg Schiffelbein about kind of an interesting partnership that they did with Starbucks, with the Opportunity Finance Network, as a way to help buttress the work of community development finance institutions. Now, I don't know if you know what a CDFI is, and we're going to get Greg to help us with the elevator speech about CDFIs. But if you're wondering, I don't know if you've seen many people wearing these wristbands. These are the wristbands that Greg will explain in a minute what they are, and maybe you saw something on the 7th game of the World Series that might have explained what it was. So Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about your challenge at explaining what you do and then how you actually get really new resources to play with in that space.
Absolutely, and there's sort of two parts to this story. The first is something OFN had been living through for a little while in our own exploration around how we tell our story and how we frame our work for partners. And then the second and really exciting part of the story is our collaboration with Starbucks. But I'll start, I guess, by saying many of you may know Opportunity Finance Network, but just as a quick aside, we're a national network of 200 community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, bound together by a shared commitment to performance, rigor, and transparency in providing financial products and services to low and moderate income communities. And right there, that's a mouthful.
That's already an elevator ride, right?
That's right. People have already gotten off the elevator and gone somewhere else. But we, in early 2011, really started thinking through how do we change how we explain what we do to people, especially partners, in a way that will help them connect to us and appreciate the work we do. And I always think about it in terms of living in a house of windows as opposed to a house of mirrors, in that it's important that we respect and understand that what really matters is how people see us, not how we see ourselves. And so trying to put ourselves in other shoes and think through what biases, what concerns, what feelings are they bringing to this before we launch into our story. So we have 3 short video clips that we're going to show today, and each one, I think, illustrates a piece of the story. And I think we'll start with the first video clip, which is an excerpt from a video that we debuted at our annual conference in November of last year, but really is sort of born of the conceptualization and work we did in the summer of 2011, and attempts to simplify and tell the story a little bit of what is a CDFI, sort of the mechanics of a CDFI. So let's look at that first video.
Informational video that tells the function of a community development finance institution. And how has that worked for you? How has that played?
Well, it's played very well, but honestly, it's what we've come to believe, or at least I've come to believe, is almost a second or third tier part of the message. In talking with new partners, and when I say partners, I mean we've shared this video with elected officials, corporations, individuals, so sort of have a broad range of reaction. But there's a couple of concepts in there that I'll just call out really quickly that we sort of highlight as part of our work to simplify explaining what a CDFI is. One is we touch on community businesses. Everybody in the United States goes very quickly to small businesses. Small businesses create jobs, small businesses move the economy. We, through this process, sort of created just an intellectual construct to call all of the work that CDFI do in the communities as community businesses. So for example, in some communities, nonprofits are the center of economic activity. They employ people, deliver services, but most people don't connect with them in the same emotional way they do small business. So whether we're talking about nonprofits in communities, affordable housing developers, or community facilities developers, we group all of those as community businesses. And conceptually, it seems to go very easily with the folks that we talk to. Another piece of this is sort of a shortcut, $1 becomes $7, and I think you saw the video, that a dollar getting pumped up there. And for us, that's a real shortcut, which was kind of difficult to get to, frankly, because we love our details and we love our explanations and asterisks. But a way to talk about the leverage that community development financial institutions create by bringing net assets onto their balance sheet, but then leveraging it with debt from financial institutions and other investors. And at the very end, there was a little bit about the virtuous cycle, which is an entry point for us to talk about 98% repayment rate and the fact that the loans are typically 3 to 5 years, so the money usually comes back to the CDFIs and continues to revolve, and so it's an ongoing process. But
right, so it's not charity in this case. It's actually investment in the community that it's a gift that keeps on giving, right?
Exactly, and it was important that we, when we first started this, we wanted to say, we're not a charity, like literally say things like that to help people understand that this is an investment. It can be scalable, that these are real financial institutions, but I think we found a more subtle and creative way to say it.
And so you talk about a more subtle and creative way to say it, which means that you're trying to get a different representation of what you do that will kind of resonate with people that they can connect with. And so you did that through storytelling.
That's right, that's right. So, this, as I said at the beginning, is, in my mind, a second or third tier message, because people don't come to us and say, hey, tell me how your
what a
institution
CDFI
works, or let's talk about net assets and what they do on your balance sheet. The easiest way to explain what we do is through a story. So the second video clip that we'll see is a little higher level message and does, through the use of a story, explain some of the impacts of CDFIs. So let's take a look at that second piece.
So there you have a way to animate the story, but also a way to kind of communicate with people and understand that these are things that touch their lives. And so I want people in the audience to think about, how would one go about composing a message like this to describe what you do? But now let's talk a little bit about this. So how did you guys arrive at this point to kind of explain CDFIs?
Well, as part of this thinking that we're doing in 2011, it became clear early on that we had to do it through stories, because we needed to really, in an emotional, visceral way, connect with people. And while it's great we find it necessary and important to describe what a CDFI is and how it works and some of those fundamental concepts, the baseline really is getting your foot in the door and getting people interested in having that conversation, and stories like this are a way to do it. One thing I'll point out here that is interesting in retrospect is we're still trying to tell, like 5 stories in this one story. We talk about, we're creating employment, we're bringing healthy foods to a neighborhood, we're helping the local economy, local farmers. So
you gave business coaching to the grocers, right?
Business coaching. So we're still trying to explain what CDFIs do, but in a way that we're still trying to touch each of the points of what they do and convey the depth, some would say, but our communications professional friends might say we're trying to convey too much complexity in that message. This was, I think, really successful and significantly changed how OFN talks about CDFIs and about our own work, and the messaging and the lessons we've learned in here have been carried through to the other communications work we do. But then along came Starbucks, and that significantly changed our worldview. We first connected with them in September, and by October 1 we had announced a program called Create Jobs for USA, and by November 1 we were live in 7,000 Starbucks stores with it, and there'd been a commercial on that played during Game 7 of the World Series, and several times, many times since then. So maybe I'll just say a few words about Create Jobs for USA, what it is.
Yeah, please do.
To kick it off. Create Jobs fundamentally is a way to allow individuals as well as institutions to pool their resources, contribute, donate, ultimately to create jobs. The donations are primarily raised through the wristbands that Max showed earlier. $5 donation at any company-owned Starbucks will get you a wristband, and all of those donations are pooled and flow through the Opportunity Finance Network. There's also a site online, Create Jobs for USA, where people can donate, and we still get a surprising number of $25 and $35 checks just out of the blue to Opportunity Finance Network from people who've seen this campaign, were motivated by it, and wanted to contribute. So far we've raised over $7 million, distributed it to 63 CDFIs. That $7 million represents approximately $50 million in lending, and we project to create 2,300 jobs.
So you started this in October, and you've raised $7 million to support your lending that you're putting directly on the balance sheets of CDFIs. And Starbucks came to you and said, we want some help to get people to help other people, and we want to make jobs. So tell us a little bit. So Starbucks had a very clear objective, and then they helped you to think even clearer about how you wanted to communicate that. And so I think you have a clip to show us, but tell us a little bit about how did you guys feel about the process through which you went with Starbucks and kind of the private sector orientation to, orientation towards outcomes, right?
Yeah. So we'll see the video in a few minutes here, but it was a learning process. It was a little painful, I think, but ultimately very, very beneficial. It was, the hardest thing for us was reframing what we do in a way that ultimately we learned really, really connected with people, and that was, this whole campaign is cast around jobs, right? Jobs for USA. So it forced us to think about all of the work our member CDFIs do in the context of jobs. So we have affordable housing lenders. What's the job impact? We have community facilities lenders. What's the jobs impact? And that was just a fundamental shift that both dramatically simplified the story we were telling, but made it much more resonant with the average person on the street.
So let's see what Starbucks produced out of this for you.
Yeah.
Wait, video? Fabulous, fast-paced, stripped-down, informational, but it's it's not down in the weeds, is it?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Every time we show this anywhere public, people always applaud afterwards
because they're inspired.
It is. It really it touches people in a way that the work we worked so hard on comes a little short, but it has definitely change the entire way we think about how we communicate what we do and the power of simplification and mass market message to really connect with people.
So let's go to Milt. I think Milt has some questions lined up over here. Oh, my friend.
Well, Milt doesn't have questions, but he has someone who does.
Yes.
With me, I have Eileen Anderson out of the Community Development Corporation in Long Island, New York. Eileen, your question?
Yeah, thanks. This is wonderful. I think that the partnership that you've done with Starbucks is amazing and really has some great messaging. And my question is, have you thought of how that might be now brought to promotion for homeownership and working with them? It would be great to see them being able to promote the same through for homeownership and education and connecting to the organization, especially on a national basis. The other part of the question was, has this changed your partnership building approach with others?
So, two good questions. I definitely think there's opportunity to broaden the Create Jobs for USA platform. I think for us, one of the fundamental lessons here was, and I think about those 3 video clips, the first one was informational, the second one really talked about impact, and the third one, in a sense, I would summarize it as say it's talking about a solution. And earlier today, you were talking about solutions and portraying homeownership counseling as a solution, and I think that's part of what the power is in this, is that we're not just telling a story about the impact we think is important, but it's engaging people around a problem that they feel is critical to solve and giving them an opportunity to be part of that solution. I think that Create Jobs for USA could become Create Homes for USA, could become Create Schools for USA. I think there are different permutations of this depending on the levels of interest, but again, it goes back to being able to provide sort of a platform for solutions.
And it doesn't just have to fall on Starbucks to support all these things. I mean, I'm sure there's other partners out there in the world that we could find who would love to align with campaigns that have kind of the power and, basically the goodwill that they'll get in the world from being able to participate in something like this as well.
Well, that's right. And in fact, Starbucks designed, when we first sat down with them, part of the discussion and negotiation was that this be an open platform. So Starbucks has clearly been a leader, and Howard Schultz personally has been engaged in this. But it's intended that other corporations, other institutions can plug into this and support it. So in fact, I hope in the beginning of April, we're going to announce another couple of Starbucks-level partnerships for this, continue raising dollars. We've raised, as I said, we've raised $7 million so far, but we have a goal of anywhere from $25 million on up for the year. So I think we'll be engaging new partners. And eventually we're going to find partners, as we're talking to them now, that for whom jobs is not their hot issue. And I think there'll be ways to broaden this in a sense.
Great, great. So Milt, I think we have another question. What do you got for us?
We do. And with me I have Anaya Oliver, who is the homeownership management consultant out of our Southern District here at NeighborWorks America. Anaya, your question?
And I think you may have touched on some of this a little bit earlier when you talked about leveraging. But I'm more curious to find out, how do you measure success at OFM within your network?
How do we measure success for OFN as a national organization, or for among CDFIs?
Actually, a little bit of both. Is that too much for you? I can just take back one, but
no. Well, it's somebody else earlier said easy question, complicated answer. Ultimately, OFN measures success by how we move the needle. $7 million on the balance sheets of CDFIs is partially a success. For this one, we've set ourselves a much higher benchmark for success. In fact, I think we've said internally that if we only get to $8 or $10 million, that we may consider this a bit of a failure. But as a CDFI and as a financial institution, we have a number of sort of clear benchmarks that we measure ourselves against, and that all of our membership measure ourselves against: ratios, deployment ratios, performance ratios, things like that. So there's a technical side to how we measure our success as financial institutions, and then OFN has a way we look at our policy and our leadership work has a different set of sort of success measures.
But you've also got the CARS rating system. And the individual CDFIs actually get rated both on their financial wherewithal and their social impact, which is something that's really important to be, once again, to be able to introduce the work of CDFIs to potential new investors. And a lot of investors are using those CARS reports to kind of figure out where they want to invest. So
that's right. The CARS is the CDFI assessment and rating service, and we spun it off and made it independent from OFN at the end of this year. So Paige Chappell, who's the CEO of CARS, is now taking that places to places that we probably didn't even know CARS could be taken to. But currently, CARS rates CDFIs that control approximately 45 or 50% of the assets, on-balance sheet assets of all CDFIs. So it has a pretty big chunk of the market, and there are a number of foundation investors and some financial institution investors that require CARS ratings for investments.
Like the Ford Foundation, for example. So, Milt, another question for us from the audience.
Yes, we have another question for you. And with me I have John Colon, who is the Executive Director for Neighborhood Housing Services of Birmingham, Alabama. John, your question?
Sure. I'm going to preface my question with a couple of statistics, just general statistics. Marriage, as we know it, is changing fundamentally. We see a lot more single mothers and single individuals in general. We know that marriages are down while divorce rates are up. And in fact, in our organization, 85% of the families we see are single female-headed households. So since part of this theme is around messaging, I wonder if there are any thoughts that have been put toward changing how we market homeownership in general. We know that in our organization, like I said, 85% are single female-headed households, but men generally earn more money and therefore have more disposable income. Any thoughts to marketing homeownership as the housing of choice, not only for families, but also the housing of choice for single men?
Boy, I'm going to punt that to you guys.
That's for the other Greg.
Yeah, this is so. You get a lot of men in Wyoming.
Can you repeat the question?
So how would we, if we actually wanted to think about how we market homeownership, how would we market it to different segments? You know, we have a different demographic out there, right? And so we could market it to single men, we could market it to female-headed households. But one of the things that we notice is that the way we've historically marketed homeownership has been to kind of the nuclear family, which is maybe the family of 50 years ago, right? So I don't know, do you guys market homeownership at all?
We do market homeownership. In partnership with WCDA, the seed for homeownership starts with the individual. Kind of, the realtor is sort of the gatekeeper once somebody, typically, once someone starts into the process. But the seed, the idea is with the homeowner, and we have rolled out, WCDA taking the lead on a First Things First campaign, and it's a very intensive marketing campaign that we exercised last year. And it worked very well. Essentially, it was paralleling someone making a decision to purchase a home with jumping out of an airplane. And would you jump out of an airplane if you didn't have a parachute and didn't have a plan in place? No more would you do that than you would start the home buying process without being prepared. So it's not gender specific, and I will be clear with everybody that there are plenty of women in Wyoming, and we're glad for it. But it's not a gender specific marketing approach. I believe in the number, maybe I've got it on my notes here, 34% of the WCDA loans that are made, or the loans that, or the clients that we coach, are married. So, and the majority of the balance are women, I believe. But we're not gender specific, but we do target and bring in and educate and coach and prepare for home ownership, males as well as females.
And I'd have to say that this kind of, highlights one of the issues that we really need to think about, which is we're not great at marketing. We don't really think about the audiences we're trying to reach. We're not great at communicating. And one of the things that hopefully you'll come out of this session with is an appreciation for the strategies we want to start to animate around marketing, telling our story, and really kind of building a bigger movement around what we do. So, Tosin, what's going on in the Twitter space?
We have quite a bit going on over here at Twitterland. I have a couple of questions. The first one, I think, is in regards to some of the clips that we watched earlier. And the question is from Brenda Mohammed, and it reads, how do these messages work on low literacy levels?
Did you guys test these messages on people with different literacy levels or different types of audiences?
No, and it's a great point, because I will say that as we've sort of the general timeline is that the messaging for the first two clips was nailed down in summer 2011, and then the Starbucks video was born in October. And I think that as I look back at that work over the summer, it's still targeted at, you know, we said we wanted to explain it to sort of a mass market audience, but it's still targeted at people that we think are traditional audiences, funders, investors, policymakers. And I think in 2012 we're going to take that and take it another step and try to squeeze it down to a more mass market message that we will test, I think, with people of all in socioeconomic levels, literacy levels, people from different walks of life, to try to come up with an even more mass market understandable message.
Because I mean, I noticed when you told the story about the grocers, I think, were they in Nebraska? Or somewhere in the middle of the country, there's a state that popped up. The story wasn't actually told from their point of view. It didn't really involve them, and maybe one of the issues we might want to think about is to kind of animate the stories with the people themselves. Possibly, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a marketer. What would I know?
Well, the theme of our conference last year in November was impact, and we did illustrate it with real people and real stories, and it creates a difference. It creates a different level of connection. I think that's right.
So Tosin, what else we have in Twitter land?
So we have another question, and it reads, the Starbucks partnership is an example of a non-traditional partnership. How can we encourage other non-traditional partners?
Well, I mean, the first, it's the million-dollar question, of course.
Right.
But I think what Starbucks, in some ways, I would say was predisposed to understand what we do. They have a deep and very broad record of social responsibility. They actually do some lending overseas to farmers cooperatives as part of their coffee and supply chain. So the idea of working with a network of lenders wasn't totally foreign to them, but we did have to help them understand CDFIs and how it works in the United States. Part of what we learned in going through that exercise, though, in terms of just communicating with the mass market, I keep saying mass market, and it took us internally a long time to understand that when we say mass market, we're not trying to reach every person in the United States, but we're trying to come up with a fundamental baseline message that could speak to anyone in the United States. And for us, part of that exercise, that's a necessary exercise on the way to finding new partners, because we want to reach non-traditional partners. We're talking to them now, but we can't do it the way we traditionally talk about ourselves. We have to do it using this new language and new imagery to help open the door for that conversation.
But just out of curiosity, did Starbucks come to you, or did you guys go to Starbucks to pitch them on this idea?
So we'd been cultivating Starbucks for 2 to 3 years. Our CEO, Mark Pinsky, is on a board with one of their social responsibility guys. We'd talked about things a few times. They, at one point, were interested in doing a micro-lending program in key markets in the United States. Nothing really came to fruition. But it was, this idea really was born in the mind of Howard Schultz. He had a pizza party at his house one night and invited 10 key staff and said, we got to do something about jobs. And you guys around the table eating my free pizza are going to figure out how we're going to do that. And it was out of that conversation, about a week later, they reached out to us as part of a number of conversations they were having to try to figure out how are they going to, and it wasn't even create jobs for USA at that point, it was just we got to do something about jobs. But they needed to find a partner to help them bring that vision to life and help shape it. And in the end, that partner was OFN.
Great. Well, I want to thank you guys, the two Gregs, for sharing with us kind of a different frame and a different way to look at kind of the work we're doing, and to really provoke us to think about how we talk about our work and get others to kind of buy into it and maybe invest and bring it to a different scale. So thanks, guys. And Tosin, do you have anything else from the Twitter space to share with us? Any comments, or as we move to wrap up here?
Yes, I do. So a couple of comments have come in through Twitter, and the first one from Emily reads, donate $5 and help create jobs for the 9.1% of Americans who are jobless. I like it. Tom tweets, imagine Google contributing to the national affordable housing effort, given their influence in online ads. Another question reads, how do we get these messages out without spending millions of dollars that we don't have? Carrie Copey from Montana tweets, we in Montana have used the term homeownership planners rather than counselors with great success. Robert Stroop writes, I think it is important to note that home affordability is more than price and interest rates. It also includes access to credit and being able to sustain home ownership. This includes utilities, maintenance, and taxes. For millions who have been unemployed or in foreclosure, at any price it is hard to come by credit. The cost of operating a home are on the rise, so it is very important to obtain HUD-approved housing counseling before jumping into home ownership. And then the last comment is by Lou Tesler, and it reads, like anything worth achieving, achieving home ownership takes work. There are no shortcuts.
Thanks, Tosin. So as we wrap up, Milt has been doing yeoman's work, getting people ready to ask the questions. And now, Milt, maybe you'll give us a few reflections on the session here today.
Sure, I will. And first, I like the comment that Tosin made from Lou Tisler. Anything worth achieving is going to take hard work. And so as we begin to kind of think about how we're going to deal with this foreclosure crisis, we realize that there probably is not going to be a silver bullet approach to solving this. It's going to be probably more like silver buckshot, if you will. And if you begin to kind of think of all the things that will need to go in helping to correct this, it's going to take quite a bit of work. We've got a lot of work in front of us. Another additional reflection that I have is, we heard a little bit about financial capability and talking about helping to build the financial capability of individuals. A lot of effort has gone into providing education, and what that education has produced has been an increase in folks' knowledge and skills. But what we're going to really need going forward is things that are going to have to help people to make adjustments in their attitudes and behaviors. And as we begin to think about this work as we go forward, certainly we'll need to put more energy, time, and effort in helping folks to adjust their attitudes and behaviors. It's not about blaming the victim. It's not about saying, but certainly I believe in Adam Smith economics, which says that the educated consumer certainly can help to correct the market.
Thanks, Milt.
All right, thanks.
All right. Yeah. And I love a guy who quotes Adam Smith, because I'm an economist, and usually we just get ridiculed. So, one of the things that we really want you to think about today, and one of the kind of the messages we want you to take away from this is that there's a lot of hard work ahead of us, and we all seem to be aligned on a vision that we think that home ownership is still a good deal for low-income people to build wealth, to move into the middle class, and we know how to do it right. So the challenge for us is, how do we get that message out? How do we get people committed to a path that's going to make home ownership a possibility for all the families we know are rewarded by it when they come through our training, when they come through decent lending products, when they come through and finding ways to really house their families. So I want you to think a little bit about the last time we faced challenges like we're facing now, which was during the Great Depression. And we did some amazing and innovative things during the Great Depression that actually built the American middle class. We invented the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage during the Great Depression when we created the Homeowner Loan Corporation. And they refinanced 1 million people out of foreclosure to stabilize the housing market in just a few years. And when they did it, everybody thought they were going to lose billions of dollars in the process. We created the FHA so that banks would lend long, because banks didn't want to lend for home ownership for 20, 25, 30 years. And we made that a possibility by saying the federal government will put its full faith behind these borrowers if they adhere to some rules. We created the secondary market that made it possible for flows of capital to come in to make home ownership a possibility for millions of people. But we also built in some unintended consequences. We built in appraisal standards at the FHA that actually were racist. They actually forbid loans being made in communities of color. They locked people out, and banks responded by redlining whole neighborhoods. The Homeowner Loan Corporation refinanced 1 million homeowners in foreclosure, and none of them were minority. And what did we do? Over 40 years, when we invented the housing finance system in the 1930s. Over 40 years, we actually immiserated inner city communities and we immiserated communities of color. So let's not do it again. We're on the precipice of actually reinventing the housing finance system. You heard it today. They're talking about what we're going to do to reinvent the GSEs, what we're going to do to reinstitute better underwriting standards. And they're talking about these crazy things, QMs, QRMs. But I'm here to tell you that the best research that I've seen done recently at the University of North Carolina showed that if we institute the current standard that they're trying to institute for the qualified residential mortgage that requires a 20% down payment, 75% of credit-worthy minority homeowners will not be able to get a loan. And these are 75% of minority homeowners. The way they looked at it, they said, if we had instituted these practices 5 or 8 years ago, how many people who are current on their loans today would not have been able to get a loan? 75%. And they said, what do we get for actually instituting a practice that goes beyond the QM standard to the QRM standard? They go, for every delinquency we would prevent, we would lock 12 people out of the homeownership market. So this is something that we actually have to weigh in on, because if we care about homeownership, we care about making avenues into the middle class, and we know that we can do it, we have the stories, we have the experience, then we have to get it out there and we have to find ways to influence what we do now, because if we don't, we're going to screw it up for another generation, just like we did during the Great Depression. And what did it end up with? It ended up with riots in the 1960s, and we tried to remedy it with things like the Community Reinvestment Act in the 1970s. So it's a big task, but it's something that only we are qualified to weigh in on. And so I think this is the charge today for you, to think differently about what you do, to find new partnerships, to communicate differently about what you do, to build a movement that says, yes, homeownership is good, yes, homeownership can work for low-income people, and we should commit to it in the future. All right, so that's the town hall. We're done.